Seminar. It's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Monty Penkower today, our speaker, who is a Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at the Machon Graduate School of Jewish Studies, Jerusalem. His numerous publications include The Jews Were Expendable, Free World Diplomacy and the Holocaust, The Emergence of Zionist Thought, The Holocaust and Israel Reborn from Catastrophe to Sovereignty, and Decision on Palestine Deferred, America, Britain, and Wartime Diplomacy, 1939-1945. And the last but not least, which you can also see here on the screen, Professor Penkower's recent publication, the topic of discussion today, 20th Century Jews Forging Identity in the Land of Promise and in the Promised Land. Just to remind you that, as usual, we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions after Professor Penkower's presentation. So if you have questions, and it's not something that directly connects to what's being said here, then I would like to ask everyone to keep it to the end. Professor?
First of all, I want to thank Manfred Gerstenfeld for the kind invitation. And now to the business at hand, since time is very limited for me to summarize what is a book of over 400 pages, I'd just like to sketch briefly the subject of this new volume that I published recently. In 1949, to mark the mid-century convocation of the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, Winston Churchill spoke about the current world scene. In that speech, he coined the term, the terrible 20th. What he had in mind, of course, was the devastations of World Wars I and II, genocides, and so forth. For Jews, particularly today, which marks internationally Holocaust Memorial Day across the world, we instinctively think of something else. We think of the devastation of World War I, the pogroms in Russia that preceded it, World War II, upheavals, and of course, the Holocaust itself. And that's only till 1949. I have written extensively, as others, about that devastation, which we call, of course, the Shoah. I've also focused on the other major event in the 20th century, perhaps in all of modern Jewish history, the rise of the State of Israel. But while doing that, I also began grappling with another major challenge to Jewish existence in the 20th century, not physical destruction, but rather grappling with one's Jewish identity. The story really begins with the Kishnev Pogrom of 1903, the first pogrom of the 20th century, which in hindsight seems like nothing significant. A blip on the radar screen, 49 people dead, 2,000 families homeless, great devastation, but it sparked other pogroms across Russia until 1906, and that, combined with economic dislocation in northern Russia, in turn triggered two major emigrations. One to the United States, well over 1 million people before World War I, and of course, what later became known as the Second Aliyah to Eretz Israel, roughly from about 1934 till the outbreak of World War I in 1914. I have focused on these two major centers of Jewish life for one basic reason. They were then emerging as, and they certainly are today, the two viable Jewish communities in our lifetime, and I think for the foreseeable future. The Kishnev Pogrom, in terms of emigration to the United States, was one angle that I looked at. It also triggered, in terms of a response to the Kishnev Pogrom, in American Jewry, especially in the Lower East Side, but also across the United States, Jews and non-Jews, as well as in London and Paris and so forth, began demonstrating against Nicholas II, the Romanov dynasty. He was the last of the rulers. the wave of pogroms was vicious. And as I said, it triggered a major emigration. Those who came to the United States had to grapple with something far different. Not pogrom, but the lure of American life. Assimilation was one out, maintaining strict orthodoxy was another, intermarriage was another possibility, and all sorts of political stands from right to left. As you will see, thanks to Thomas fixing up this PowerPoint, I divided the book basically into halves. One devoted to the United States, it's 4 chapters, and 4 to Eretz Israel. Not merely to maintain the balance in terms of length, but I think the only way to study this is to give them equal time. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the first one looks at someone who is not well known except those in the Yeshiva University and similar worlds, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Selmanovitz, who was of a very unusual type. On the one hand, he was a Gera Chassid, who was sent by the Gera Rebbe, the one who escaped the Holocaust and came to Eretz Israel, to serve as the major Gera voice in Lower Williamsburg, where the major community was, but also, remarkably, to serve as a Rebbe and Mashgiach in the seminary of Yeshiva University, Rabbi Isaac Yochanan Theological Seminary, where he became good friends with Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, the father of the eminent and well-known Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. Half of his 8 children left Orthodoxy. None intermarried. The other half remained true to traditional Judaism. But many of their children, 3rd generation, and that's always the test. Ben-Gurion always said, I define a Zionist by which grandparent wants to have their grandchildren living in Eretz Israel. The 3rd generation, sociologists tell us, is the real test. And by the 3rd generation, many either left the Jewish fold, intermarried, never married at all. 2 remarkable things about Selmanovitz. Number 1, he played an integral part in rescuing the Gera Rebbe during World War II and brought him from Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto, to Eretz Israel. The second is, given his close friendship with Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, he played a major part in seeing that Rabbi Yoshe Ber succeeded his father. This is all delineated in that chapter. So there we focus on orthodoxy and what happens to it. Second chapter is very different. Felix Frankfurter comes from Vienna at an early age, goes to City College, the story is known, Harvard, and then of course a very young professor of law, where he is a professor of law until he becomes the 3rd Jew to arrive at the Supreme Court, appointed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His predecessors, Brandeis and Cardozo. The minute that Frankfurter arrived in the United States, he basically chucked his traditional beliefs from Vienna. After 13, he never entered a synagogue again, and he transferred his Jewish loyalties to some eminent justices like Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great liberal, Louis Dembitz Brandeis, and of course Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom he idolized. And then, once appointed to the Supreme Court, there was his true loyalty. Once on the court, unlike Brandeis, who was on the court until 39, and he died about a year later, Frankfurter never spoke about Jewish issues publicly, only occasionally tried to pressure Roosevelt, not during the Holocaust years, but on Palestine pre the White Paper of May 1939, and admitted in later years that he really was guilty of not even speaking out to Truman during or before the UN vote of November 29, 1947. his conflicted Jewish identity appears, and this to me is the most fascinating, in some of the Supreme Court decisions, where the brethren, as they're called, wanted him to mute some comments in his opinions, where he's referring to Jewish loyalty, the American flag, which is why he voted against any person such as the communists having the right not to salute the flag, and so on and so forth. Many such opinions. And when he died, he insisted. By the way, he intermarried a congregational minister's daughter that had no children. He insisted that his body be cremated. And that taught me a new English word. I have a fine English vocabulary, but I never heard of cremains before. And I located where those cremains are located. His wife, who died a few years later, was put also in the vault next to him. But he insisted, I came into this world as a Jew, and I want to go out as a Jew. And therefore his one close Orthodox friend, Professor Louis Henkin of Columbia University Law School, was asked by Frankfurter's will to deliver something in the memorial service. And Henkin said, I'll say the Kaddish, which nobody, of course, understood but Henkin. That's Frankfurter's story. With the American Council for Judaism, we have a totally different episode. This was the first anti-Zionist organization created in the United States. And ironically, in the height of the Holocaust. It really surfaced in 1942. This chapter focuses on why these people embraced a non-Zionist stand, an extreme non-Zionist stand. The last vestige was the Executive Secretary, Emil Berger, who kept on to this position even through the Six-Day War of 1967. Their primary concern was dual loyalty. The fear also that if we followed the majority of American Jews and Jews worldwide, it should be said on this Memorial International Holocaust Day, who were converted to Zionism because of the Holocaust, as a result, they were afraid that if they followed the majority, their loyalties would be challenged. I want to be a good American, hence American Council for Judaism. We are Americans who happen to be Jews. But their Jewish identity was a very lukewarm reform one at best. The vast majority, of course, even within the reform camp, the CCAR, which was the lay person's organization for the reform movement, already in 1937 changed its old Pittsburgh Platform 1885 position. Throw out any reference to Zion in the prayer book and so forth. Already in 1937, and this is before the Holocaust, given the crisis facing Jews in Germany, Poland, Romania, etc., began to champion a Jewish haven in Eretz Israel. That's 1937. So the next generation of students at the Hebrew Union College, where they got rabbinic ordination, strongly embraced Zionism. There were many major names, Philip Bernstein and others, Freehoff, I don't have to get into the names now. They were clearly not reading the tea leaves correctly. One of these supporters in the beginning was Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times. His story is also a fascinating one, but there's a twist. Because on his mother's side, he had strong Sephardi Jewish connections. And the family embraced this because they wanted to be connected to the daughters of the American Revolution. American patriotism first and foremost. And since an ancestor had fought on the side of the American revolutionaries, Sulzberger, his wife, and all the children were properly inducted into either the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution, etc. Sulzberger was very different from his parents. Whereas his mother was strongly, fiercely proud of her Sephardic ancestry, although not supporting Orthodoxy, but they had a membership in Shearith Israel, the Sephardi congregation in New York City. In addition, we had the father, Cyrus L. Sulzberger, who came from Germany and whose in-laws looked down on him. How could their fine, standing daughter of Sephardi heritage marry this German banker? But in fact, Cyrus, as a result of the Kishnev Pogrom, strongly began coming out, not only in favor of Zionism. He went to the Congress, even took his young son Arthur with him, but Cyrus became a major force behind the creation of the American Jewish Committee and things of that sort. He worked with Schiff and others to support stricken Jewry in Russia and elsewhere. Sulzberger made one trip, and one trip only, to the Holy Land in 1937. And he came back thinking, I was a foreigner. I had no place there. My place was America. And like his father-in-law, Alfred Fox, who purchased the Times in the 1890s, he made sure to mute any positive statements vis-a-vis Zionism in the columns of the New York Times. Fox was also very concerned about the possibility of being charged with dual loyalty. And in the 1930s and on, with rising anti-Semitism in the United States, Sulzberger, who took over after his father-in-law died in 1935, had much more to be concerned about. The Times, as Laura Leff and others have shown, took a consistently anti-Zionist position as a result of Sulzberger's stance, but also muted, as we now well know, all or almost all references to the singular plight of European Jewry before and during the Holocaust. He was, behind the scenes, a major force in the creation of the American Council for Judaism. Until the United Nations, already in the beginning of November 1947, began to shift towards the support of two states in Eretz Yisrael, and particularly when America, thanks to Truman mainly, took this position and had his supporters in the UN, like Eleanor Roosevelt, who was strongly pro-Zionist by then, to support this stand. Once that happened, then the New York Times recognized basically the new emerging Jewish state, de facto. Nothing more. It was only in, I think, the late 50s, particularly in the 60s, with the Six-Day War, that you see a shift. And Sulzberger died shortly thereafter. And by then, his children had intermarried. He had grandchildren from all faiths and no faiths. Interestingly, his son, the younger son, who took over for a time, was much more at ease with his Jewish identity. And I know personally that it was he who played an instrumental part in having the first Orthodox Jewish chaplain hired by Columbia University, a good friend of mine, Chuck Shearer, from Yeshiva University. It's a different time. It's the late 60s. When he died, he insisted, as Frankfurter, that his remains be cremated. And they were right near those of his father-in-law, but not below the grave. He said, I've always stayed under his shadow. It's time I stood on my own, even in death. And his wife, Iphigenia, who wrote her own biography, was much more pro-Israel than her husband. But nevertheless, they both left Shevet Israel membership, as he left other memberships, including Temple Emmanuel, where he was a trustee for a time, Jewish Theological Seminary, because JTS, for example, after a shilly-shally back and forth, because the chancellor, Louis Finkelstein, was also very divided on the question of Zionism, he ultimately left his membership there. Shevet Israel for two reasons. One, because the then rabbi, David de Sola-Pool, was a strong Zionist, as was his wife, for a time national head of Hadassah, Tamar de Sola-Pool, and also because, on one occasion, an Israeli flag made its presence into the synagogue. Sulzberger walked out, never to return. This basically is the American side of the story. Notice the book cannot possibly cover all of 20th century Jewish identity. No book could. So I elected, because of, as I said, I wanted to focus on the two viable Jewish communities, to focus in depth on individuals and organizations to which they belong, to reflect this tension and transformation, conflict, throughout in all these stories. Bialik is a fascinating story. What child, way back in Israel, didn't have to memorize Bialik? The last decade of his life, Bialik spent in Eretz Israel. And for all the recognition that he was the national poet, nobody listened to him. That's the long and short of it. For two reasons. Politically, he was increasingly out of the mainstream. For reasons that I'm now discussing in the book I'm writing about Palestine in the 1930s and the international arena, events in Europe, the rise of communism, fascism, Nazism, certainly affected politics here. The center, to quote the famous poet, did not hold anymore. You moved increasingly to a battleground between the right and the left. The right centered around Jabotinsky, and those to his right, Achimeir, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, Yevin, and that circle. And Ben-Gurion and Labor on the left, and those to his left. Basically, Bialik, who was a man of the center, a moderate, pro-Weizmann, and when Weizmann was kicked out of the chairmanship of the Jewish Agency Executive and Haim Arlosoroff took over, he was in that camp. The murder of Arlosoroff in 1933, which I don't want to go into here now, basically turned Bialik against the Zionist political scene in Eretz Israel. And from a literary point of view, the new generation of Shlonsky and others found that Bialik was just old hat, old school. They were much more into modernism and so forth. And Bialik died a bitter man. An operation in Vienna in 1934 that didn't go well. When the body came back for burial here in Tel Aviv's old cemetery, the city was dressed in black, in mourning, says Henrietta Zoll. You wouldn't believe it. Thousands into the streets. But this was all after the fact. Bialik wrestled. He realized, too, that the emerging young men and women of the Yishuv were far distanced from the world that he came from. The world of Russia, Odessa, Volozhin, a knowledge of the Jewish sources, whether or not one accepted them or no. And so he was really the odd man out. Nevertheless, he was still considered the national poet. A lost opportunity for orthodoxy, back to orthodoxy. This is a sad story in my mind. Believe it or not, in 1937-8, there was an effort made to bring together Agudas Israel and Mizrahi for joint work in Eretz Israel. And there was some in both camps who favored, some opposed, mainly in some of Agudas circles. Don't have to mention names now, it's all in the book. And ultimately this failed. And I call it a lost opportunity, because both had different perspectives, and that's why the unity could not come about. Agudas Israel was basically quietist. We wait for the Messiah. There was no clarion call for Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, to remake, from a Torah's perspective even, a new society. Yes, there were minority voices, but they were far and few between. Isaac Breuer, for example. He was really the support for, intellectually speaking, Poalei Agudas Israel in Eretz Yisrael, who already were ready to join with Poal Mizrahi, for example. Mizrahi, totally different story. One wants to refigure, to transform the land according to the famous formulation of Meir Bar-Ilan, right? Torat Yisrael, Yam Yisrael, Be'eretz Yisrael, Al Pi Torat Yisrael. That formulation, it's an activist position. And not surprisingly, some of Ben-Gurion's strongest supporters, politically speaking, in the 30s and 40s, were people of Mizrahi, Rav Fishman, later Maimon, and Bar-Ilan, then Berlin. A lost opportunity. They're grappling both with Jewish identity, activist, quietist, and also the transformation of the land and how might a Torah lifestyle or a Torah influence impact on this country. Arlosoroff's murder in Israel political divide gets us right into the growing divide between the right and the left. Even before Arlosoroff's murder in June of 1933, he, the political director of the Jewish agency, Shaltok, later Sharet became his successor, Arlosoroff was also of a very mixed mind in terms of Palestine's future for the Jews. Though a moderate, he already in 1932 wrote a letter to which Weizmann never responded, privately to Weizmann, which increasingly came to support many of the positions of the revisionist Zionists under Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky. Arlosoroff was damned by the right because, among other things, he not only took Weizmann's position publicly, but he, before his death, went to Germany and was very instrumental in setting up what later became known as the Ha'avara, the transfer of German Jewish property, funds, via property to Eretz Yisrael, to strengthen the Yeshiva and save these Jewish lives. And the right wing said, but you're shoring up the German economy. And so the Jabotinsky forces strongly called for an international boycott. That's a whole confusing story. For our purposes, the revisionists were accused, individuals, of murdering Arlosoroff. The right wing claimed this was a blood libel, a phrase that Sarah Palin and others seem to be using these days, a blood libel in order to weaken the right wing. And the brickbats flew back and forth, back and forth. Ultimately, the two revisionists accused of the murder were found innocent. The left wing said on a legal technicality. The right wing said they're innocent. The irony is that the prime one, who was really supposed to be hanged at the end, Avram Stavsky, when he got off, embraced Rav Kook and others who strongly came out for his innocence. Stavsky later was murdered in the ill-fated Altalena story, you know, of the summer of 1948, not far from where Arlosoroff was murdered. That political divide between the right and the left has major ramifications for Israel's polity in the decades to follow. And I try to chart that to indicate how, again, this acrimony just continued well through the Rabin assassination. Finally, Shlomo ben Yosef, from a British gallows to Israel's pantheon to obscurity. There is a little sign as all Israeli signs in Jerusalem, Hebrew, English, Arabic, but nothing else. In East Talpiot, with the name Shlomo ben Yosef. And all around, on different streets, are other names of some who were hanged by the British. The gallows in Acre, and then two in Jerusalem who committed suicide before their hanging. Shlomo ben Yosef, a typical Beitari, arrived on the so-called Aliyah Bet, immigration, illegal immigration, they called it Afalti, despite everything. And when, in retaliation for Arab murders of Jews in 1937-38, 3 young men, Shlomo ben Yosef one of them, decided to retaliate for this and try and check the ongoing Arab revolt and its attacks on Jews. The revolt began in April 36, was only put down just before World War II for various reasons by British forces with Jewish help. Shlomo ben Yosef and 2 others who were in Rosh Pinah attacked an Arab bus that was traveling in that direction. No one in the bus was injured, shots were fired, bombs were thrown. All 3 were brought to trial. In the end, he was the only one who was brought to the British gallows in Acre. A second one was declared mentally incompetent and stayed in jail for some years. The third was declared too young to be brought to death, although we now know that was a forged birth certificate, but that's a separate story. Shlomo ben Yosef, like most Beitaris of that time, was committed not only to Rosh Beitar Jabotinsky, whom he idolized, but to the whole vision of Uri Tzvi Greenberg, Abba Achimeir, and the others. You should be ready even to sacrifice your life for the country. Both sides of the Jordan are part of the Jewish state. We need a large army, etc., etc. Shlomo ben Yosef was hanged in June of 1938, the first Jew to be hanged by the British Mandate authorities. Of course, to the right he became a hero. To the left, a very confused innocent who was, alas, poisoned in terms of his mind by Jabotinsky and that circle. In later years, of course, there was a fight, and there's a fine book by Uri Lebel, Baderech el Pantheon. One day it'll be put out in English, On the Way to the Pantheon. Who enters, and that's a fascinating study in itself, the Israeli pantheon of heroes. And as we know, history is written by the victors, most often. And so until Menachem Begin came to power, there was almost no reference to these victims of the British Mandate system. Those who went to the gallows were all members of the Etzel, the Irgun Tzvayat Leumi, or the Lechi, Lochamei Chirut Yisrael, of Avram Stern and company. And only with Begin's coming to power were these people recognized in stamps and commemorations, state commemorations. And soon after Begin's coming to power, he insisted that he fulfill a vow that he would have an impartial state inquiry to find out who really killed Arlosoroff. That inquiry, long story, I'll make it brief, of 3 judges decided 2 things. One, the 2 accused, Rosenblatt and Stavsky, Rosenblatt and Stavsky I mentioned, did not commit the crime. And 2 out of the 3 said, we do not have enough evidence to conclude who the murderers were. The 3rd, Rabbi Berkowitz, was swayed by the evidence that the revisionist belief was conclusive all the years that 2 Arabs had committed the deed from various pieces of evidence. And so, to obscurity. Because even when he enters the pantheon, memory is short. Alas, as we know, the next generation has very little interest in past history, by and large, and I would suspect that if you walked into that area and asked any passerby, 9 out of 10 would not know who Shlomo ben Yosef was. It's true, every time at his yard site, at his year of the anniversary of his death, there is some commemoration, but by and large, into obscurity. The book has no conclusion, because I'm convinced, and I wrote this in the conclusion, I'll just read it to you. The issue of authentic Jewish continuity remains, both in Israel and in the diaspora. The personal and collective meanings which its members will ascribe to their Jewish identity elude safe prediction. That dilemma cannot be avoided when life increasingly encourages multiple identities and diverse commitments. Articulate advocates for universalism on the one hand, and for Jewish particularity on the other, made their case since the beginning of the modern era. And so the debate is not concluded. And the grit of history, particularly, and today this resounds, I trust, its malignant and unexpected knots, has also to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Schmidt?
Thank you very much. I teach a course at Hebrew University at Prof called The American Jew and the Israeli Jew, a comparative analysis, are we still one? And I would like to pose the question to you. I take it up to the very last day that I teach whatever is going on, fine, so I don't leave it just there. Do you feel that the American Jewish identity, as it's developing now more and more a minority in terms of identified Jews within a majority population that has changed radically in the last 20 years, or as expanded, and the Israeli population, which is also changing, it's the right word, etc. Do you feel that we still have enough of a connection to remain one people?
That would take at least 5 lectures.
All right, well, I have
brief.
a whole semester to play it out.
I don't, right here. It's clear that there is a distancing. Particularly, I'm concerned about the younger generation, whose memories of Israel are certainly not our memories, who also are bombarded on campuses, and here Manfred and others in this fine institution can verify this adequately, by all sorts of anti-Israeli positions. I don't want to use the word propaganda now, although some can easily do so. And one has to confront that reality. There are ways to confront it, but I think that what we ideally have to do, because the future belongs to the youth, is have these groups somehow get together more and more. I don't think that the pull of Israel through not only the Six-Day War, I mean even beyond, is as strong, certainly, as it used to be. And remember, too, that in what is called a postmodern society, there are very few definite positions that people ascribe to anymore. And as I said, there are multiple identities. And then in America, too, there is the, I think, tremendous draw of secularism and also a lifestyle that encourages acceptance of Jews as Jews to intermarry and get to the highest places and so forth. And so it would be very difficult to check that. I think only if the next generation is able to sit down together and discuss various issues honestly can new ties be developed.
But do you think that in light of, for example, the response to Peter Beinart's article in the New York Review of Books, and the fact that he has now become the favorite lecturer all over, including at the American Jewish Community's
Right.
Global Issues Forum in April, etc., do you feel that his position, which you can explicate if you wish, but
I don't
so
want
many
to,
people
yeah.
here do know it,
Mhm.
more and more represents that of the younger age group, or, there's a difference of opinion about distancing from Israel and not distancing from Palestine.
That's correct. But as I said, I, as an academic for many years before retirement, have always believed that one has to be prepared intellectually to grapple honestly with issues and also to confront such arguments. And that education has to come through a classroom, through visits, things of this sort. Without it, it's a difficult
Do you
issue.
think the 10-day visit of birthright is
No.
enough?
10 days is certainly not ample, although it's a start.
Well, some of them come back.
That's
Some
true.
of them come back and are in our class, but some of them come back.
But that's a rush job, so to
That's a
speak.
rush
I
job.
think when you have Israelis visiting America, going into homes with these people or into their campuses, and vice versa, it's a very different story.
But in America, there's what Manfred calls the comfort level,
Yes.
and that comfort level is increasingly important.
Correct. Yeah.
I have Artie Geldman and Israel Medan.
Excellent, Matthew. Thank you. And I look forward to buying the book. You pick mostly personages from quasi-political realm, except for Sulzberger. Everyone else seems to Frankfurter maybe in law. What if you would have chosen, for example, people from the arts,
Mm-hmm.
people, I'm talking now about the United States, not about Israel, from the film, the world of film in the 1930s, who also tried very hard to integrate and assimilate and not draw attention to their Jewishness.
So you have the same story. This has been written up. By and large, Jewish intellectuals, as we call them Jewish, they were, I think, very distant from their religious state. Ludwig Lewison is obviously an exception that proves the rule. Ben Hecht also, only because of the Holocaust, adopting more of a Irgun position. But the vast majority of intellectuals at the time were involved, obviously, in the 1930s in city college left-wing politics, things of this sort. And they only in later years became or some of them became neocons like Crystal and that sort of thing. And Daniel Bell, who just passed on, the same story. I think the story would not give us any new revelations in terms of their great, as I said, distancing from things Jewish per se. They were very worried, the playwrights and the movie people in Hollywood and so forth, in tackling Jewish issues. Same story. It's very different today. I'm reminded of the story of a lady who goes into a New York post office. It's Hanukkah time, and she says, "I'd like some Hanukkah stamps." So the teller says, "What denominations?" She says, "Has it come to this? Okay, 25 Reform, 10 Orthodox, 15 Conservative, and that's only 3. Today we have a multiplicity of possibilities. In those days you didn't have that multiplicity. But at the same time, I want to connect this to something said earlier. I'm also encouraged that while it's true that numbers-wise, all the facts seem to go against any connections, not only to Israel, but to things Jewish, but the quality of Jewish introspection, limud, studies both here and in the United States by young people, I think is also an encouraging aspect. There are possibilities. It's not going to be any more a structured connection to a synagogue or things like that. But there is also, I think, a search at the same time for one's Jewish identity in different ways. And that to me is welcome.
You're picking up on Samuel Howman's position of quality versus quantity. But basically I was talking,
You're focusing on Israel, I
focusing
understand.
on the different ways in which Israeli Jews grow up, go to the army, for example.
Correct. It's a radically different world.
Radically different world. And to what degree the two groups can find some interconnection, not just support from the United States, which was financial lobbying, but also some kind of peoplehood.
Well, it seems to
Israel connection.
It seems to me, to answer that further, more effort has to be done, it seems to me, to encourage in this country, through education, more of a sense of a Jewish identity, which will speak more to Americans than an Israeli identity, which is far removed from them. And this has to be done in many ways. I think there was another question.
Yeah.
In your research, and of course, since we haven't read the book, I can't tell whether it's in there. I do know, through my research also, a significant amount of two types of people. Either American Jews who had gone to Palestine before World War I and either came back because of the problems during World War I or later on, or Jews from Europe who, from then Palestine, who came to the United States. Did you come across any of that in any sort of influence, et cetera, cross-pollination and stuff like that?
No.
From those who would come first from the land of Israel back to the United States?
Did not. The exceptions are, for example, Henrietta Zold or a Golda
Besides
Meir.
Rabbi Kahana.
No, I'm saying, in terms of Henrietta Zold or Golda Meir, Meyerson then, and look how differently each one turned out. Zold was a strong proponent with Magnus of a binational state. Golda became a strong laborite, even more so than she was in the United States. I don't think you can therefore draw any conclusions. But I will note that the first page of Golda's autobiography begins with her earliest memory.
In Milwaukee.
No, her earliest
pogrom,
memory is
the
a
pogrom.
pogrom. And they're hiding in the cellar. That is a memory that doesn't speak anymore to American Jewry at all. And understandably so. For Israeli Jews, it's a different story. It's not anymore the question of pogrom, it's the worry of maybe Iran's nuclear reactor, things of that sort, or terrorism from Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. It's a totally different neighborhood. And that makes the dialogue between the two sides come back to this very different concerns. One in America has the luxury of going right into university, into your professions. In Israel, there's army service. And when you're in your regular lifestyle, you then have to come back to Miluim often. It's a totally different thing. And then also, the other difference is, if you speak of distancing, the distancing between Jewish populations in Eretz Israel, which obviously befuddles the American Jewish imagination.
I could take that my students, when I mentioned Jabotinsky, talked about Jabotinsky, volunteer. He was crazy. He was a nut, and that's what they're doing to us.
And yet, as I said, there is still that sense among certain circles of contributing to the government because takes priority to I, and you have different points of view on this within Israel proper. American Jewry has a very different constellation of issues to deal with.
If you were writing a paper for my class, and you were answering, are we one? So I was like, you would waffle on me.
I would. I would.
Who would say it? Okay.
I should say. Yes.
In your discussion of a lost opportunity for orthodoxy, you didn't mention the name of Rav Kook,
Yeah.
who worked both with the secular and the religious. So by implication, are you then theorizing that his efforts with the Orthodox failed?
Well, I don't have to theorize because Rav Kook died before this lost opportunity took place.
20th century?
Okay. No, this I know.
Yeah.
the gentleman who left actually is writing a biography for Yale on Rav Kook, Dr. Yehuda Mirsky, and I'm sure he will enlighten us on that subject. But it's clear that Rav Kook was not able to bridge two communities earlier. He tried in something called Degel Yerushalayim at the end of World War I. It went nowhere. One of his major disciples, ironically, I cited him, was Isaac Breuer, who met Rav Kook when he came in 1933 first visit, was very impressed, and he, as this chapter will show, is really formulating a program to bring the two sides together along Rav Kook's lines. And I was very lucky to find, it was the first time found, the actual blueprints for that program, and it's there in an appendix.
Ambassador Lopez and then Professor Redman.
Actually, I just wanted to make a short remark with regard to the spirit of conciliation, whatever that was created by Menachem Begin. But I think that already Prime Minister Eshkol had started to build some kind of bridge by giving permission or green light to bring the remains of David Raziel, as much as I remember.
And Jabotinsky.
And Jabotinsky, of course. So this is, I think, something that to take into consideration.
I appreciate it. That's true. And Eshkol, interestingly, has certainly risen in the historians' eyes in terms of a fine prime minister in this regard. Let us recall that Eshkol was more of a pragmatist. He wasn't Ben-Gurion, a strict idealist. And Ben-Gurion, for all his greatness, like all great men, has many chinks in his armor. And one of these was clearly his rather acerbic attitude towards anything that went against his party line. That didn't simply mean Jabotinsky. It could be Tabenkin from Kibbutz HaMuchar, it could be the communists, it could be Mizrahi, anyone who was, and Weizmann, already in the 30s, not to speak of the 40s, the men were at loggerheads. It was Ben-Gurion who saw to it that Weizmann's name did not appear on the scroll of independence. Let us put it in a broader framework. But without Ben-Gurion, there never would have been a state. You have to see it all. So I certainly give full credit to Eshkol for doing so many great things and trying to bring the different sides together. But it didn't wash for very long because the acrimony just continued and poisoned, as I said, the political air for decades into this century, I would say.
Leslie?
I'm not sure if a humble Brit is allowed to intrude in this discussion of American jury. It's interesting to me because I really know very little about these people other than their names. You said at the beginning that the real test is the third generation. Now it seems to me you may not have a conclusion, but I think you have a thesis, which is by the choice of these people, you are concluding that it doesn't survive. In my interpretation, what you just said, there are three people here who start off, two people in one organisation, who start off very parallel, even as they start their life in the USA, and eventually get weaker and weaker. And even poor old Rabbi Selmanovitz finds that four of his children are Orthodox and the third generation are marrying out. So it seems to me these are not choices by accident, because there are many, many American Jews, many, many famous American Jews, I don't know them. But I'm asking the question, would it not be possible to find some American Jews whose Jewish identity is much stronger in the second and third generation?
That already brings us into this century, not the 20th.
Well, all right, I'll stop where you stop. I don't know where we stop, but the message I've got here is that in American Jewry, Jewish identity can't survive, because you start with people who are not there, who are already wanting to be American, and even those who don't, like the Ger Rebbe, finds he has not income that in his children, or in some of his children. So I'm just saying, but would it not be possible if I wanted the thesis, if I wanted to test the thesis but it is possible to survive. It's not 20th century, but would not a Senator Lieberman figure of the first half of the 20th century be evidence that it, under certain circumstances, it can survive? So I'm trying to understand why you chose these four out of so many that could have been chosen. And they all, as I read you carefully, and I thought I listened to what you said, they all end up in the same at the same point.
I didn't choose them consciously to prove a thesis. I was very interested in these individuals because it seems to me, not only on the Israeli side, but just focusing on the American side, that they reflect a lot of what was going on, can't cover the whole ballpark, in the 20th century. Of course, you can pick individual examples, as I said. Somebody asked about the intellectuals, so I pointed to Lewison or Ben Hecht from a religious angle or a political one, but these are far and few between. Lieberman is on his way out of politics. I think that, nevertheless, it is true that he indicates that there are possibilities. I'm not saying it's a totally lost story. What I am saying is it's a difficult story. There are tensions that remain. Transformation continues. And I'd be keenly interested to see, if you mention the third generation, what happens after Lieberman. You know, so that's another question too. I'm more optimistic about the 21st century in terms of the quality that we mentioned, because there are more study groups, not only the rise of orthodoxy, as statistics show in Baltimore, but also within reform and conservative organizations, there is more of an appreciation of alternatives that bring people into Jewishness. Let's certainly credit the late Debbie Friedman in this regard, just passed away, opening new possibilities that hitherto were just closed. There was no song in these organizations. The people drifted away. People are starting to come back. And I see the enthusiasm. And I know from what people have said in the Limud conference in upstate New York recently, these possibilities. It's not all black and white. But I didn't pick these people purposely, as they say, the chatchila beforehand.
It just sounded black.
No. Yes.
Dr. Friedman?
Yeah, I would also wonder at your selection of people, thinking of a person like Jacob Javits, people who are really strongly Zionist and is at the heart of the American political life. A second question I would ask is, it seems to me the presentation of the picture today of the Jewish community more strongly, with greater possibilities, it seems to me totally different from the sense that I have. I remember Erev Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim. I was in the United States at the time. The whole Jewish world was electric. Everyone was concerned. Everyone was involved. Everyone was worried about the survival of Israel. Here you have half the intellectual people in the Jewish world who are totally against Israel. I can name you 50 intellectuals who are prominent in the United States today. I don't care if they're interested in 50 different other things. They're not for Israel. They are against Israel. I mean, the whole J Street phenomenon. We're talking about a world today which is divided in a very, very serious way in the question of the survival of Israel, the survival of, what we're really about here.
I didn't disagree, but that's already a 21st century phenomenon. We didn't have a J Street, I think, in the United States. We had some people around in the 1960s, but in the 70s. Machon, but that was a minority then. Today it's a different story. And I think that there is a lot of support in Israel for this position as well. I don't think it should be limited to a discussion of what's going on within American intellectuals. It's true in this country as well.
Obviously, the whole world of the Haaretz neged Israel. I mean, this is not something you look upon, I think, with equanimity. It's existential danger. It's not a neutral phenomena.
I just have to make you recall the remark of Menachem Begin on Haaretz in terms of, it's not only now, he once said famously that the last time Haaretz was on behalf of the Israeli government or at a government in the land of Israel was when the British mandate was here.
Well,
There's a long way since
I would,
then.
yeah, I would be leery of simply dismissing Haaretz as anti-Israel. It might be against the particular government, but in a democracy, one is certainly allowed to take such positions. Yes.
So I don't want to get into a debate here with you. I can name you the people who write regularly for Aretz.
I know.
From Yitzchak Laor,
I know.
and I'll go down the
Olive
list.
Ben,
Professor Sternhall. You know, it's limited. Yeah, yes, once in a while you have the Israel Harel here gives an article here, but what you're talking about is a fundamentally anti-Israel position of the
Totally
leaders of
post-Zionist.
Israel. What?
Post-Zionist overall.
That's right. It's a different story.
Okay, did you want to ask something? Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. So I have Jim Blackham first, and you wanted to ask something? No, Easy Libler second, and Jonathan Porat third.
I just want to say, I think the picture in America is very complex, and I think you've got all sorts of paradoxes going on. Because in the days of Felix Frankfurter or Sulzberger, people, especially the German Jews, I think tried to be more American than the Americans and not be too Jewish. But today, a lot of the intellectuals or the filmmakers are almost exploiting their Jewishness. Hey, I'm Jewish, that's cool. You know, let's have a Steven Spielberg, or let's do a Schindler's List. Let's do other television series about Jewish families in the Holocaust. So I think it's quite a complex picture, and I think perhaps from what you said today, it didn't portray that.
What I did indicate already, that Sulzberger's son, one of the sons, strongly was in favor of having the Times shift its political slant, bringing more Jews into the major editorial positions, etc. And they were major figures in the Times after Sulzberger's death. So I didn't leave it totally in oblique. You have to see the next generation.
They still are making.
Of course. Of course. Max Frankel, I mean, these were major voices for the Times.
Is it please?
I'd like to perhaps challenge your suggestion that the situation today is better this century than the previous century. Because the two things that kept large Jewish communities going were migrations from East European Jewry and anti-Semitism. Take both those two factors away, and you're left with a situation where, as you say, rightly, anti-Semitism is of a different nature. If we talk about Europe, it's different. We're talking about America today. I don't know what America will be tomorrow. May well catch up with Europe. But America today, there is all the factors that will, in an open society, in a truly open society, and a postmodern society, that suggest that for a minority, unless you have the equivalent of an Orthodox group where the religion and the practice of the religion keeps them together, the inevitability is mass acculturation with perhaps elite staying. But if you talk overall, I think we've never had a worse prediction that we would have if we look at the American scene today in terms of objective situation.
We'll stick around and find out, Noam.
Oh, well, I'm just asking whether you agree or disagree.
Well, that's already for this time. As I said, it's true. The numbers are not encouraging in terms of not only distancing from Israel, things Jewish, intermarriage, things as you said, but on the other hand, this comes back to what was said earlier about Heilman, it's true that there is also, I think, a qualitative difference in the smaller numbers, which is a stronger, richer Jewishness than those in the 20th century who didn't have this at all. I mean, I remember, this is just personal examples. When I began graduate school at Columbia University in the early 60s, I was the only Jew who walked around on campus with a kippah in the graduate faculties of the arts and sciences. And not the sciences, the arts, liberal arts. All the Dati people who walked with kippot were in Israel Rabbi, science and math departments, etc. And I knew them all. There was a Yavin organization, very active. There were no open sheurim on classes and things of that sort. You see this on campuses all over. You see stronger, I think, Hillel organizations than there were in my time. And so I think the jury is still out on this issue. I'm focusing on the quality. I agree that quantitatively speaking, the future looks bleak in that regard. And this is a question.
A comment.
Yeah.
Heilman ends his book, Portrait of American Jews, which is a series of speeches. The last sentence, the last paragraph, is if I want my grandchildren to remain Jewish, I will have to take a boat to Israel.
Well, years ago, even Arthur Hertzberg, who wasn't of this group, the late Arthur Hertzberg, ends his attempt to give a historical analysis of American Jewry on a very bleak note. And that was years back, years and years ago. Yes.
Since we're talking about the sequel, which is the 21st century Jews, which is why your book I think is so incisive, because it makes us ponder today as well. A major factor clearly is the total expansion and changing the definition of what Jewish is. We'll just get two examples which we all know. Among the two most identifiable Jewish events, and again, one has to come to this with a different kind of, I would say, halakhic perspective. Whatever you may have come with, it's changed. The Jewish wedding of the year was Clinton's daughter married, but we used to think, I thought a Jewish wedding was two Jews getting married. A Jewish wedding was one Jew getting married, which to some people may seem to be like very bizarre, but in that context it was the way to go. And certain people saw it and said, that's good for me also. Or Representative Gifford, she should have a refuah shlema, who is not halachically Jewish, but she's part of the Jewish community. And she identifies with the Jewish people. And it's good for the Jewish people. And so what does one do with people who choose to continue? We used to think, in this time, that assimilation was a walkout and you were leaving. It's not so. People identify in other kinds of ways, which I think we have to readjust our own categories. If we're going to look at the future by the old categories, there's a disconnect there.
I agree. That's why I said the jury is out for this century. I guess Jews have to be proverbial optimists. Yeah. And so we hope that, what else? We're still around.
Of course.
Yes. Do you have a question? Oh, okay.
No, we had Hannah Gibbon and then Dr. Dursley. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very informative. One is involved I studied everything from a base Ruckel to a reformed day school. And it interested me very much that the reformed HBC was beginning to go back to Kashmir.
Right.
This was, I don't know what the reason was, but this was a very interesting note. Also birthright, I think, that there's a difficulty, there's a disconnect between the American Jewish community and the Israeli community. And I think that birthright has done a great deal to help this. I know one young man who grew up without anything Jewish, intermarried siblings, and came with birthright and fell in love with the country and became a frum fellow. He studied at Noam in Jerusalem, and it turns out that he's a Kohen. So he married my granddaughter, so I happen to know that story, which thrills me because it shows me that something can happen in that way. I think there was a lot of negligence on the part of Jews who immigrated to the United States, whereas in the Shtetl in Europe, the shtetl could be Jewish. People lived in a certain way, and when people came here, they did not realize the need to educate their children formally in knowing about religion. I think that created a tremendous abyss, which we have now. And of course, young people on college campuses, American campuses, are instructed according to Mitchell Bard. The Saudis have been funding their education, which brings out the wrong thing in many of our own graduates, and that I think is really important.
Well, one can always point to bleak examples. You mentioned the reform, so I can mention Hadassah. I remember serving as a scholar in residence just when Hadassah decided we were going to have kosher at all our meals. That's in my own time. That changed, obviously. But yet Hadassah now is confronted with who will fill the ranks of the next generation. The numbers are plummeting. So it's not that simple. And my hope is that with increased Jewish education, broadly defined, as you said, opening our eyes to other possibilities, I'm all for this. My late parents encouraged me to believe that continuity and change were necessary, not only for survival, but also for a meaningful Jewish existence. And so that leads to the conflict. To what point, and no further. So, and finally, let's not overlook luck. You don't realize, not simply because one comes to America with a good family or to Israel, that instinctively everything will, turn up roses. It's a lot of luck. I know families where people left the fold. I know people who turned right-wing in religious terms and politically on both sides of the fence. I don't think there are any guarantees here. I think the excitement is to see how it's going to play out. And as I said, I think it's still an open story, which is why I could not even offer a conclusion for the 20th century. Whomever I had chosen, by the way, on the British angle, what's fascinating there is that until the Holocaust, the vast majority of the British leadership was at best non-Zionist. David Goldsmith, Neville Lasky, Lionel Cohen, I can mention all these names. And the turning point came in the early 1940s when a professor of math at Leeds by the name of Selig Brodetsky became the head of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And nevertheless, look what happens in England today when a Chief Rabbi Sachs, a scholar of obvious repute, is not able, he doesn't feel comfortable enough to go, let's say, to a funeral of a leading Reform rabbi, or to go to a Limud conference, because who knows what the people on my right, religiously speaking, might say, and they certainly don't give him any ear. So, in terms of England, I'm not that encouraged.
Neither of us.
Well, I am, but then I've spoken of it. So I won't do it again.
Okay, fine.
Fine with Dr. Gerson.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, before I make a few remarks, thanks a lot for a very enlightening lecture. To summarize, two major Jewish communities over a century in, say, 30 minutes plus is quite remarkable. And I think you really very, very clear. I think the lowest point for American Jewry in my mind came at the end of the 1990s. And the absolute flag carrier of that was Arthur Boswell. Arthur Boswell,
yeah.
Who said, Jews, the Jewish problem has been solved, we have to, let's all run after the environment because Judaism has nothing to offer anymore, which of course was an absolute idiocy, but I think it was symbolic for the time. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is perhaps bigger. Can postmodern society survive? Postmodernity, which is partly based, of course, on deconstructionism, is something which is against society, lives by its collective being, and postmodernity and deconstructionism favor individualism over collective. Over the collective society. We are going to a decade which will bring huge problems, partly economical, because you already start seeing it, that you get for the first time a generation which will not live better than its parents on the average, which is something, of course, we are totally unused to since the Second World War. Secondly, we have a Muslim challenge, which may work out in the United States a little bit better than it will work out elsewhere, but which nobody can ignore. Besides that, you live in a complex society which is exceptionally, by its complexity, becomes extremely vulnerable. We have to look at two totally different things. 9/11, where a couple of, or I always prefer above 9/11 as an example, the shoe bomber. One idiot puts explosives in his soles, and tens of millions of people have to take their shoes off for decades. And the other one is WikiLeaks. Another example of how vulnerable all this is. In this context, I don't think that it is such a bad idea that Jews have to muddle through. We are essentially muddling through in anticipation of much larger forces from the outside, which will determine our being.
Well,
and that is, it's not a very convenient thought, and I understand you don't have a conclusion, but I mean, people don't like to think of their lives as muddling through, but that's well what it may be.
well, my only response is I don't accept the idea of muddling through. My parents always were activists, grappling with the world, and that's how I raised my children. I hope they'll raise their children that way. And by example, I think if we can show to the next generation, not focusing on Israel only, that used to be perhaps one's identity, a UJA check, and that was it in the earlier century in America or elsewhere. But I think that Judaism still has something to really contribute to one's world and lifestyle, and that has to be done in an intelligent fashion, not any pablum, critically speaking. And that's why I think Limud also has a great attraction in America and in Israel, but also within secular circles in Israel, Alma and others, serious Batei Midrash who are studying texts. And I think if people grapple with texts, they come to their own conclusions and no longer accept spoon-fed, simple Judaism, which generally turns out to be simplistic. And I think that a mature grappling with these issues is not muddling through, Manfred. And I hope that my children and their children and all of them together and their associates, that's why the book, by the way, is dedicated to my grandchildren, will in fact grapple with their own identities intelligently and hopefully come out on a good side and be happy.
So Monty, where can we get the book?
Okay.